Hello everyone, this is Pushpoint, and I am your storyteller. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe the channel.
After where are you from and what time you are watching now, get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Rain House.
Miles from any town, down a crooked road lined with skeletal trees, stood a house no one remembered building.
Ivy draped over its steep roof like a veil, and the windows stared like hollowed eyes.
The house was not on any map, nor spoken of in local histories, but for Eliza Marin, a folklorist chasing stories of the drowned chapel, it stood as if waiting for her.
The rain had followed her for days thick, slow drops that blurred the windshield, soaking the narrow forest roads until they shone like mirrors.
Her GPS died somewhere beyond the last gas station, but the car kept finding turns that led her further in, as though the woods wanted her to arrive. She didn't decide to stop, she simply did. The house appeared around a bend in the road she couldn't remember taking.
Towering, dark, and old, yet intact.
The roof held firm despite the moss and creeping vines, and the wooden siding had aged not with decay, but with something deeper like it remembered things.
The kind of house that felt heavy with time.
The rain intensified the moment she stepped out of the car.
It fell harder and faster, pushing her toward the open porch as if her only refuge was inside.
She stepped through the door.
It did not creak.
It did not moan.
It opened like it had always been waiting for her to cross its threshold.
Inside, the air was dry, but still thick with the scent of old wood and something faint of salt. The floorboards were warped, but not rotten. Dust lined every surface, yet the hearth held unburned logs,
as if someone had only just left.
Eliza was no stranger to haunted places, or stories that clung to forgotten buildings like spiderwebs.
But there was no story here.
Not yet. She was alone, notebook in hand, pen poised, recording details in the margins of silence. But the silence didn't hold. She heard it first at midnight.
A soft dragging across the floorboards upstairs.
Slow, heavy,
deliberate.
She checked the house when she arrived. No signs of animals, no human presence.
But that sound was not the settling of an old house.
It was movement, something pacing, something aware.
She lay awake listening, heart beating slow and hard in her throat, rain pounding steadily on the roof.
The sound would stop for long stretches, then resume just as she began to hope it had ended. By morning, the sound was gone, but on the wall by the stairs, a small wet handprint had appeared. No child had been in the house, no puddles from outside, just that single, glistening mark sliding down the faded wallpaper. Eliza stayed.
She told herself it was for the research, for the chance to find some record of the chapel rumored to sink beneath this land over a century ago.
But something deeper rooted her in place.
She began hearing whispering behind the walls, faint and soaked with static, like a recording played underwater.
On the third night, the rain stopped. Absolute silence fell over the woods, and with it, a pressure, the kind you feel beneath the surface of deep water. The windows fogged over, but she saw shapes moving beyond them, tall and slow, pacing just out of view. She didn't open the door. Instead, she lit the hearth.
The fire crackled once, then hissed out, extinguished by a wave of cold air from the chimney.
On the blackened stones, a ring of small white teeth appeared.
Children's teeth, arranged in a perfect circle.
Eliza should have left them.
But her legs moved slower, her thoughts blurred.
Her dreams became soaked in voices whispering names she didn't know, begging for the door at the bottom of the stairs to be opened.
But there was no door there,
just a wall. Until the fifth night, rain resumed, harder than ever.
Water dripped from the ceiling, but the roof showed no leak. It came from inside. The wallpaper peeled back from the stairs, and beneath it, a handle rusted, briny set into the wall.
Eliza opened it. The stairs beyond sloped downward, carved into stone that glistened with wetness. The air smelled of ocean rot, though she was hundreds of miles from any coast. She descended. The whispers grew louder. At the bottom was a room, submerged in ankle-deep water.
In its center, a pulpit.
The drowned chapel, all around it. Shadowed figures stood motionless, their faces turned toward her.
Their eyes glistened like fish beneath the surface, and they opened their mouths in perfect unison.
Eliza understood nothing.
Yet every word felt true. When she awoke, she was upstairs in bed. Dry, her notebook on the nightstand filled with pages of words. She didn't remember writing an unknown language spiraling across every margin.
She didn't leave. She doesn't want to.
The rain never stops now.
Story 2. The Lantern Keeper. The village of Dorsch Hollow was not found on any map after 1892.
Hidden deep in the folds of an ancient forest, shrouded in fog that clung year-round to its crumbling cobblestone paths, it was spoken of only in hushed warnings.
If the road turns colder than your breath, you've gone too far, old farmers would mutter.
No one lived there now, they said, but that wasn't entirely true. Anna Wilkes came to Dorsch Hollow chasing silence.
She was a restoration artist, used to weeks spent alone with paintbrushes and crumbling paper.
A commission brought her to the edge of the forest, an old church ledger, water damaged, its pages stuck together like layers of flesh.
She rented a cottage miles from town, near the wood's edge, but the further she worked through the book, the more she noticed the same entry repeating. A name, Lantern Keeper. No other designation. No birth, no death. The date beside it varied, sometimes in the 1700s, other times in the 1800s. But the handwriting never changed.
Always that same sweeping loop of the L. The final R curling back like a fishhook.
One stormy evening, she wandered into the woods. The road dipped in ways it hadn't before. Fog thickened.
Her flashlight grew dim despite new batteries, but still she walked, drawn to a flickering light in the distance.
A warm, golden glow that bobbed slowly among the trees.
Lantern light.
The figure holding it stood still as a post, back turned.
A tall, gaunt man in a weathered coat, his wide-brimmed hat drooping like wet bark. He didn't move when she called out, didn't turn.
Simply walked, slow and smooth, deeper into the woods. She followed. The forest gave way to a hollow basin, and there it was. Dorsch Hollow, every building intact, preserved in a sepia haze. Houses leaned together like weary conspirators. Windows were lit, but no one stared from them. Smoke curled from chimneys, but no voices. Only the creak of the lantern keeper's boots on stone, echoing too loud in the damp air. He led her to the chapel at the heart of town.
Its bell tower stood crooked, roof partially caved in. Yet the doors opened effortlessly. Inside, dust clung to pews and a damp chill hung in the air.
On the pulpit, another lantern sat unlit.
The lantern keeper turned at last.
His face was not rotten, not ghostly, just wrong.
Too long.
Eyes too small, mouth too wide.
His voice, when it came, was slow and wet. Light it. Anna stepped forward. She wasn't sure why she obeyed.
The lantern on the pulpit flared to life the moment she touched it. No flame, just light. A cold, colourless beam that washed the chapel in bone white. Then the pews creaked. Figures rose from them, soaked, silent, eyes shut tight. Their clothes hung with silt and waterweed.
Their skin pale as birch bark. They stood, unmoving, as if waiting for a sermon. "You keep it now," said the lantern keeper, and then he was gone.
The light from the lantern would not go out.
Anna left the church, still holding it, and the town was gone.
Trees surrounded her once more, but the road was different, curved wrong, tilted as though the earth remembered something she did not.
The sky had darkened unnaturally, and her watch had stopped.
Back at her cottage, she tried to forget.
She doused the lantern in water, sealed it in a wooden crate, buried it behind the shed.
But each night, she awoke to it on her windowsill, glowing softly. The silhouettes of wet figures stood just beyond the tree line, watching. They were patient. She moved towns, burned the crate, tossed the lantern into a river. But the light would return, always in the darkest corner of whatever room she tried to sleep in. The faces would watch from puddles and reflections. The ledger began writing itself again too. Names that weren't there before, people long dead, people not yet born.
All beneath a new title, Interim Keeper.
C. Wilkes. One morning, she woke in the middle of the woods again. The lantern was in her hand.
Behind her, the sound of wet footsteps.
Ahead, the soft creak of the chapel door opening. She no longer resisted. Some nights, lost hikers still claim to see a figure holding a lantern near the ruins of a village no one remembers.
They say the light seems to follow you, bobbing steadily, whether you run or stay still. They never see her face.
They just hear the whisper, as wet as drowned wood. Keep the light burning.
Story 3. Under the Floorboards.
Eleanor Cartwright had lived alone since her father died in the winter of 1983. The house he left behind stood alone at the edge of a moor, distant from the village, cloaked by thickets of blackthorn and fir.
It was a place where silence wasn't a visitor, it had roots.
The house never creaked.
That was the first thing people noticed. No matter the wind, the storms, the shifting temperatures, it never made a sound, as though it had learned long ago how not to draw attention.
Eleanor didn't mind the quiet. In fact, she preferred it. She had grown used to the rhythms of her solitude, tending to her greenhouse, reading under the yellow glow of her old floor lamp, and preparing tea at precisely 4 o'clock every day.
That is, until the scratching began.
It started in the southeast corner of the parlour, so faint at first. She mistook it for the memory of sound, just a dry, repetitive whisper beneath her chair. But the next day it returned, stronger, deliberate. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch. Eleanor assumed it was a mouse, or perhaps a trapped bird beneath the floorboards.
But when she peeled up the corner panel with a crowbar, there was nothing.
Just darkness, and the deep scent of earth that hadn't seen light in a century.
That night, she couldn't sleep.
The sound came again, this time from her bedroom beneath the foot of the bed.
She sat upright, blood cold.
It wasn't frantic like an animal. It was measured. It felt time. She lay still, waiting, pretending not to hear.
The next morning, she found long gouges on the underside of the rug.
Not claw marks to even, like someone dragging a sharp stick across the boards, inch by inch in a pattern. She stopped having tea at 4.
Her hands began to tremble, and her sleep grew thin and restless.
Each night, the scratching moved,
from the parlour to the kitchen, from the stairs to the hallway, always just beneath her.
Never seen, never caught, only heard.
And only at night. Then came the whispering.
It wasn't words, not at first, just breath.
Wet, muffled breath. She began to dread the setting sun.
The shadows seemed to cling longer in the corners, as though the house itself were bracing for something.
One evening, desperate and exhausted, she took a hammer and began tearing up the floorboards in the hallway. She worked until her hands bled.
But beneath the wood, she found only ancient stone tiles, smooth and cold, etched faintly with symbols she didn't understand. Circles inside circles, and I carved inside a spiral. She left the floor open and fled to the village. They remembered her father. A quiet man, they said.
Kept to himself. One of the older men at the pub leaned in close, ale trembling in his hand.
That house,
it's older than any of us.
It was built over something.
My grandfather said it was a meeting place once.
For the followers. Eleanor pressed him for more, but he only shook his head. That night, she returned to the house.
The wind howled across the moor, but the interior remained still, silent unnaturally so. She tried not to listen.
She tried to read, but the books on her shelf had changed. One by one, their pages had turned black.
All except for one, her father's journal. It now lay open on her desk, a passage circled in shaking ink. You do not hear them.
They hear you.
Do not speak beneath the boards. Her throat tightened.
It was too late. The whispering had found words now. They spoke her name slow and low, as if bubbling up through water, and beneath the whisper, something heavier shifted, dragging itself inch by inch beneath her floor.
She locked herself in the upstairs bedroom, the only room with outward beneath. She didn't sleep. She counted the seconds between the sounds,
always in threes. Scratch, whisper, drag.
When she opened her eyes, the door was open. She had not fallen asleep.
She was certain of it. But the door, which she had barricaded with the dresser, now stood ajar. The floor was wet.
A handprint long, thin fingers and no thumb was pressed against the wall beside the mirror,
and her reflection was missing. She screamed. For days, they found the house empty. No sign of Eleanor.
No blood, no footprints. Just torn up floorboards and the journal lying open on the hallway tiles, its final entry fresh and scrawled.
It's not under the house. It is the house.
And I let it listen too long. Now, travellers crossing the moor late at night say the house sometimes lights a single window. They hear scratching in their dreams, always coming from beneath the bed.
And sometimes, when the wind is right, a whisper.
Come closer, I know your name. Story 4. The mirror room. It was supposed to be a simple job.
Desmond Lane had been restoring antique homes for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen rot, mold, even snake dens under floorboards. But he had never seen anything like the Holloway house.
Hidden behind overgrown hedgerows at the end of a sunken lane, it loomed 3 stories tall, Victorian bones wrapped in ivy and shadow.
The job: restore the east wing for a historical registry submission. Simple. The owner, an absent recluse named Mr. Holloway, communicated only through typed letters left on yellow paper.
Do not alter the north hallway. Leave the attic door shut.
And do not, under any circumstance, remove the nailed boards from the mirror room. Desmond raised an eyebrow when he read that last part. The mirror room sat between the 2nd and 3rd floors, part of a narrow offshoot where the ceiling sloped unnaturally low. The door was sealed with 6 thick wooden planks, nailed deep into the frame. The number 13 was carved faintly above it.
Naturally, Desmond asked around.
None of the locals remembered the house ever having a mirror room. Some claimed Holloway's great-grandmother was a spiritualist. Others muttered about his ENCs gone wrong. One insisted the room had been sealed since 1901, after someone vanished inside it without a sound. Desmond didn't believe in hauntings. He believed in wood rot, black mold, and unstable beams. But something about the room gnawed at him, especially when he began hearing tapping from behind the sealed door. At first, it was faint, just soft thumps, as if something on the other side was gently testing the boards.
Then, after a week, came the scratching.
Thin, sharp, deliberate like nails dragging down glass.
The 2nd floor grew colder each night.
He checked the furnace. No issues. Still, a chill crept from that sealed hallway, seeping beneath doors, frosting the edges of his breath. When he worked alone in the east wing, he felt watched. Mirrors he hadn't touched appeared smudged, always with a faint impression in the shape of a hand. One morning, he found a crack in the wood over the mirror room door. It hadn't been there before. The nails were rusting, loosening, and from within, a light now flickered, dim and grey, not electric, more like moonlight over still water. Desmond pressed his ear to the gap. He heard whispering,
Dozens of voices,
murmuring not in English, but in some backward cadence, like breath drawn in reverse. He should have stopped then, but something inside him appalled. Allure needed to see the room. He returned at night with a crowbar, his breath fogging the air, his hands shaking. Each nail screamed as it was torn free, as if the house itself resisted.
When the door swung open, he was hit with stillness.
The room beyond was circular, small, and lined entirely in tarnished mirrors.
Dozens of them, floor to ceiling,
All cracked, all bowed slightly inward.
and in the center, a single wooden chair facing an unbroken mirror.
The air was thick, heavy. The moment he stepped inside, the door slammed shut. Desmond turned. The mirror in front of him was not showing his reflection. It showed the room behind him. Yes, but it was wrong. The angle was slightly off, and the Desmond in the mirror did not move when he did.
It sat in the chair, head tilted.
Then, slowly, it smiled. Desmond backed away. Every mirror now held a version of him, some twisted, some eyeless, some weeping blood. Each one turned toward him, one by one, mimicking movements he hadn't made.
Then they began to knock on the inside. He spun toward the door, tried to wrench it open, but the frame had melted into the wall. Cold breath ran down his neck.
He turned. The mirrors were empty. The versions of him were gone.
The silence swelled like a tide. Then a whisper behind his ear. Now there's room for one more.
They found him 3 days later.
The room was sealed again. Every board back in place. Every nail freshly driven.
No signs of forced entry.
No fingerprints. No Desmond.
But in one mirror on the far left wall, you can still see a man sitting.
He's frozen in mid-turn, mouth half open, eyes wide with horror.
Sometimes people claim the mirrors in their homes start to fog over after visiting the Holloway house. Just a little, just around the edges.
And in the steam, handprints. And once in a while,
a reflection that lingers a second too long after you've turned away.
Story 5. The station below. Trains hadn't run through Rodham Hollow in nearly 70 years.
The tracks had rusted over like skeletal remains in the marsh, swallowed by vines and silence.
But deep beneath the moor, carved into stone and memory, Rodham Station still existed, sealed and unmapped. A relic no one visited and few remembered.
Except for Conrad Bell.
A municipal records clerk by trade, Conrad lived in quiet routine. He documented forgotten town blueprints, zoning requests, and crumbling property deeds. That's how he found it. An incomplete survey from 1931 referencing Rodham Hollow Lower Terminal. No plans existed after that.
No demolition orders, just one line at the end, written in smudged pencil. Close the doors before the 13th hole. He thought it was a joke.
But Conrad was curious.
He followed what remained of the tracks from the woods, stepping through thorns and rot. It was a grey afternoon in early autumn, and rain misted the landscape in a curtain of silver.
He nearly walked past it, an arched stone opening in the side of a hill, overgrown with ivy. Half-buried rails ran straight into the earth like veins into flesh.
He brought a lantern and descended. The stairs spiraled downward, carved of blackened stone, slick with moisture and moss. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind refused to follow. The station waited below.
It opened into a vast platform, cloaked in mildew and darkness.
The lantern cast a golden pall of light, which the shadows swallowed hungrily. Ancient benches lined the walls, their metal frames eaten by rust. A cracked timetable hung beside a shattered ticket booth, and there, at the far end, sat a train.
It wasn't on any record Conrad had ever seen.
6 dark carriages, perfectly intact. No logos, no windows.
The door stood slightly ajar. He felt it immediately. The sense of being noticed.
The train breathed,
not in sound, but in presence.
like a room full of sleeping strangers who had just stirred at his arrival.
Still, he stepped forward. The urge to board was illogical, yet almost physical.
He could feel something drawing him to the third car.
As though he had done this before.
Inside, the carriage was impossible. It was his childhood kitchen,
down to the chipped blue ceramic dish in the window, the knotted rug by the sink, the exact slant of morning light from nowhere.
He stood frozen.
Then the lights blinked. The room shifted.
He was 7 years old again, hiding under the table during a storm, watching his mother speak to someone in the hallway.
Someone he could never remember, even years later. But now he saw them clearly.
They turned toward him, a tall figure in a black coat and narrow hat. Their face was blank, not disfigured, just missing, as if smeared from memory.
They raised a gloved hand and pointed directly at him.
The vision snapped. He stumbled out of the carriage, panting, back on the platform. Everything was darker now.
His lantern flickered erratically.
A low hum thrummed beneath his feet, like a long dead engine waking. He checked his watch.
13 minutes past midnight. Somewhere deep in the station, a bell rang once.
Then again, a slow, echoing toll. Conrad ran for the stairs, but the path had changed. The entrance now led into another platform.
Another train. Each car showed a different memory.
Some his, some not. A funeral he never attended. A dinner with strangers who knew his name.
An empty classroom with a chalkboard that read, "You boarded long ago." By the 9th toll, he was no longer running. He was walking.
By the 11th, he was calm. By the 12th, he stood before the 6th car, the only one still closed, and he knew it was his.
He stepped inside.
It was dark. He sat, somewhere far above. The bell tolled once more the 13th and final note. Then the train began to move. No one has seen Conrad Bell since.
The authorities found his abandoned flashlight and an old notebook containing maps of places that don't exist.
But some nights, when the moor is thick with fog, people say they hear a distant whistle beneath the earth, a mechanical groan of tracks and metal. And if you're very quiet near the old hollow, you might see a thin light flicker behind the ivy-covered entrance. Don't follow it. The train is always looking for more passengers.
Story 6. The Lantern Keeper. There is a lighthouse on the northern edge of the Keswick Cliffs, far beyond where the roads end.
It's not listed on any modern map, and hasn't been lit in over 80 years, at least not officially.
Locals whisper about it. especially during storm season. But none admit to having seen it up close. Some say the sea around it changes color when the wind shifts. Others speak of a figure that walks the cliffs, lantern in hand, though no one remembers hiring a keeper.
Lena Miles had heard all the stories, of course.
She grew up just inland, in a fading coastal town called Thorn Bay.
After her mother died, Lena returned home to settle the estate.
She was a marine cartographer by trade, with an eye for historical anomalies. One morning, while combing through old family records, she found a journal in her grandfather's attic, tied shut with a weather-worn cord.
The name on the front,
A sea.
Miles Keswick Light, 1921 to 1934.
Her grandfather never spoke of working a lighthouse. The entries inside were brief and methodical logs of the tides, strange bird migrations, shipwrecks too far from shore to explain. But toward the end, the writing changed.
Words grew jagged, unsure. Entries repeated, dates circled back. He wrote of voices in the fog and lights under the sea that pulsed in rhythm with the beam. Then the final page, lanterns lit itself again.
Winds don't sound right.
Something in the surf said my name.
If I go up tonight, I may not come down. Lena was no stranger to myths.
But something about the detail, the specificity.
It clung to her.
On the second night after reading it, she woke at 2:47 a.m. to the distinct smell of salt and oil and a faint glow on the horizon, far out past the cliffs where the lighthouse should have been dark. By morning, she decided to see it for herself. She followed a crumbling path through pine scrub and wind-scoured fields. The cliffs loomed taller than she remembered, black stone rising like broken teeth from the sea.
And there it stood, the lighthouse.
Tall,
Narrow,
sea-washed white.
no fence,
No lock, just a rusted door that opened when she touched it.
Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of burning wick.
She climbed the spiral staircase slowly. Light filtered down from above, not sunlight, but something colder. The closer she got to the top, the more she felt the vibration through the metal railing, a pulsing rhythm, like a heartbeat not her own.
When she reached the lantern room, she froze.
The great lens, long decommissioned, spun slowly on its own.
A wick burned in the old oil chamber, though no oil had been used in decades.
The light was pale blue, and with each rotation, it seemed to paint the sea with shadow.
And in the far mist, there were shapes.
Not boats, not birds, figures standing on the waves, watching. She tried to leave, but the stairs were no longer behind her.
The door had gone.
The entire chamber had shifted, subtly like a corridor of mirrors that no longer reflected anything real.
Lena backed against the wall.
The glass around her rippled, and from the beam's glow emerged a figure tall, draped in oilskin, face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. The lantern keeper. He raised one gloved hand and pointed at her, just as the light flared brighter. In the moment of searing illumination, she saw what he had become, a hollow thing, stuffed with seaweed and salt, its mouth sewn shut, its eyes filled with black water.
The beam passed, and Lena was alone again, except
she wasn't in the lantern room anymore. She stood outside the lighthouse, but the sea was wrong flat and glassy, like a mirror left out too long in the rain.
no wind, no gulls, and far below, her own reflection in the surf didn't quite match. It blinked a moment after she did.
That night, Thorn Bay residents saw the Keswick light burning steady from dusk to dawn for the first time in generations. A soft, unnatural blue.
It hasn't gone out since.
Sometimes hikers still vanish on that trail. Others say that if you walk near the cliffs when the light swings across the fields, you'll see someone standing at the top, lantern in hand, watching the waves.
They say she looks like Lena, but she never blinks. Story 7. Whisperwood House.
They told me not to go back.
After her brother Jonah disappeared, the whole town quietly agreed to forget the place where it happened.
It was easier than admitting that a house could be wrong fundamentally, spatially, spiritually wrong. But May had to know. She had to understand why the house had taken him, because she remembered every detail of that night. The cold, electric stillness in the air, the way their breath fogged even indoors, and how Jonah, her practical, cynical twin, walked into the dark hallway and never came out.
No doors,
no windows, just one creaking step and gone. Whisperwood House had been empty for decades before they broke in that night. A dare, a thrill, just a group of teens and flashlights. But the interior had been too pristine. No dust, no decay.
Every room staged like someone had left only hours before. Mid-conversation,
Half front glasses of water,
a radio softly crackling static.
coat still hung neatly by the door, and the whispering, soft, continuous, barely audible over the sound of their own breathing.
The voices never grew louder, but they were always there just beneath thought, threading into the silence. And when May turned to look for Jonah, he was already gone. Now, 10 years later, she returned.
The house stood at the edge of the old orchard, untouched.
Local kids threw rocks at the windows sometimes, but they never broke.
Whisperwood didn't age. It didn't change. It simply waited. She stepped inside just after dusk. The air was unnaturally dry. The floorboards didn't creak under her boots, though she remembered vividly that they used to. Everything was still in place, the same water glasses, now stained slightly with age, the same radio, humming without signal, and the whisper started again immediately. May paused in the hallway, flashlight trembling in her hand. The light flickered.
Ahead of her was the staircase to steep, somehow deeper than it should be, fading into a perfect black. That's where he disappeared.
She called Jonah's name once. The whispering stopped.
The silence that followed felt like a held breath.
Not hers.
Something creaked upstairs. She ascended.
Each step took effort, like moving through water. The light grew thinner, weaker. At the top, the hallway stretched longer than it should. Doors on each side slightly ajar, breathing open and closed. And at the end, Jonah's bedroom. She opened the door. It was exactly how it had been 10 years ago. Posters peeling from the walls.
A telescope by the window.
His jacket slung over the chair, and him standing by the far corner, back turned, perfectly still.
Jonah, her voice cracked.
Is that?
He turned slowly.
It was his face, but the wrong expression, the wrong eyes.
As if someone had practiced wearing him like a mask, but didn't understand what made a human convincing. His mouth moved, but the voice was lay at his, and another beneath it.
Deeper, older, full of hunger and mimicry.
You took too long, he said.
May backed away, heart hammering. You're not him. We remember you. The voice said, we remember everything.
From behind her, more doors creaked open.
The hallway shifted,
expanded,
grew impossibly long.
The walls pulsed like lungs. May turned and ran, but every hallway led to another version of the same room.
The radio, the whispers,
the blue jacket.
Each time she burst through a door, she ended up back at the start. The house was no longer a house. It was a loop, a mind, a trap, and she had entered its memory. Hours passed, or days.
She couldn't tell. Her flashlight died.
The whispering became laughter, low, crooning, imitative.
Then she found it a door that hadn't been there before.
Made of dark wood, carved with symbols she couldn't read.
It opened into a stairwell that descended deeper than anything above.
She followed. At the bottom was a room of mirrors, dozens of her, fractured and flickering, each with different expressions, some weeping, some grinning, one mouthing something silently.
The real May stepped forward. Behind her, the door vanished.
One of the mirrors began to move.
It wasn't a reflection anymore.
It was her older, sunken-eyed, wearing Jonah's jacket.
And it whispered, "This is how you stay." Then the lights went out.
They found May's car 2 days later, still parked by the orchard. Inside were scattered notes, her grandfather's flashlight, and a small voice recorder.
It captured only one thing, the sound of May breathing ragged, close interspersed with soft, rhythmic whispering.
In the background, faintly, her brother's voice, "I told you not to follow me."
Story 8. The Mourner's Field. It said that past the last row of hedgerows on the east side of Bramble Parish, there's a path that only appears when the sky is the colour of ash.
Not thus, not storm.
A flat, breathless grey, like the world's taken a pause.
That's when the field shows itself. Not a normal field, either. Too quiet, too even. The grass never grows tall.
There are no insects, no wind, no smell of soil, just a cold stillness and a steady hush of air not moving.
It stretches flat for maybe a quarter mile before it ends at a rusted gate, and beyond that, an old Victorian funeral house.
Locals call it the mourner's field.
People don't go there.
Not since the 1920s, when 4 parish boys disappeared, and their mothers claimed to hear them crying just past the hedgerows weeks after the search had ended. People still talk about it in the pub. No one laughs, but Iris still didn't believe in stories.
Not really.
She came back to Bramble Parish after her father died, having spent 10 years away in London pretending home was somewhere else.
The cottage she inherited was small, musty, filled with the scent of pipe smoke and the dry rot of silence.
Cleaning it out unearthed boxes of old town papers, maps, and a journal labelled simply Fieldwork. Her father had been a gravedigger, no surprise, but the journal's last entries puzzled her. I saw her again.
White dress, pale eyes, no shoes, just past the gate. She waits.
I think the field remembers us.
Or maybe just what we've lost.
The final entry read,
I'll try again before the frost.
She calls stronger now, like wind in a coffin. Iris had never known her father to be poetic, or prone to fantasy.
He barely spoke at all, truthfully.
But the entries nodded her.
And on a dry afternoon, with the sky just turning that particular shade of grey, she took her boots and went to find the hedgerows.
They opened for her.
The path was unmistakable once it appeared, cutting through the trees like something carved, not grown. The field beyond it looked untouched by weather.
Dead still, yet somehow alert as if it noticed her. She walked, each step muffled in the grass. The gate ahead groaned open, slow and reluctant, and she stood before the funeral house, 3 stories of aged timber and weather-worn glass.
One shutter knocked loosely in the breeze, though she felt no wind. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air pressed against her skin like wet cloth.
Old wood,
cold stone.
She passed dusty pews and faded portraits on the walls, strangers frozen mid-sob. The floor creaked as she walked, the boards echoing too much, like footsteps behind hers that stopped a second too late.
She reached a small parlour at the back, where a window overlooked the field.
And there she saw them, a line of people, maybe 20 in all, standing motionless in the grass, facing the house.
Dressed in black, pale-faced. Not one blinked. She tried to leave, but the parlour had changed. Where the doorway had been was now a mirror, and in it, her reflection wasn't hers. Same shape, same hair, but older, tired,
and her eyes were grey.
The reflection opened its mouth, and Iris felt a cold breath in her ear.
They're not mourners.
They're what remains.
She turned, and the room had filled with soft sobbing, faint, all around, coming from the walls, the floor, the mirror. Some voices she recognized.
Her mother, her father,
Aunt Lucy, who died in childbirth, and somehow her own voice, a version of it anyway.
Younger, frantic. You left me here, it cried. You promised we'd go together. The window showed the figures drawing closer. Iris backed into the corner, heart racing, hands trembling. The journal had said she waited.
A woman in white. And now Iris saw her walking slowly toward the house.
Barefoot, mouth sewn shut with something black.
She carried nothing, yet her arms moved as if holding something invisible. A child.
Iris screamed, but no sound came, just a hollow exhale, as if something had taken the sound before it reached the air. The last thing she saw before the window shuttered inward was her own reflection reaching out from the mirror, not to stop her, but to pull her in. The next morning, the field was gone. The hedgerows looked untouched.
The gate rusted shut, and in her father's cottage, the journal lay open to a new page, one Iris hadn't written.
She understands now. We all mourn something. That evening, a parish boy swore he saw a woman in white walking just past the trees, barefoot, pale-eyed, carrying nothing in her arms.
Yet he said he could still hear crying. Story 9. The windowless room. The house had been empty for years before Ethan moved in, drawn by the low price and the quiet charm of the neighborhood. It was a narrow 2-story cottage tucked between a row of older homes, all bearing the faded marks of time.
The previous owner had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only dust and silence. Ethan didn't mind the silence.
He'd spent years in cities crowded with noise and restless shadows, and this house promised something else, stillness.
but the stillness came with its own kind of weight. On the first night, Ethan noticed a door on the ground floor he hadn't seen during the walkthrough.
It was small, painted the same color as the walls, and lacked a handle. He pressed his hand against it cool, smooth, and felt a faint vibration beneath the surface, like a heartbeat muffled by layers of plaster. Curiosity piqued. He tried pushing and pulling, but the door didn't budge.
Over the next days, he searched every corner of the house, but the door remained firmly sealed.
It gave no hint of what lay behind it, except a faint hum that grew louder as night fell.
Sleep became difficult. Ethan dreamed of rooms he'd never seen, bathed in pale, flickering light. He was always chasing shadows just out of reach, his breath shallow, his limbs heavy. One evening, after a storm had passed, the hum swelled into a low moan. Ethan, unable to resist, sat before the door, tracing the edges with his fingers. The surface felt warmer now, almost alive. Suddenly, a thin crack appeared along the door's edge, growing wider and revealing a sliver of blackness beyond. He leaned in, and the blackness seemed to pull at him, cold and deep, as if the door led not into another room, but another world. Against better judgment, Ethan slid his hand into the gap. His fingers touched something soft like velvet, but it pulsed with a subtle rhythm, like the slow breathing of something sleeping. The moment he withdrew, the door slammed shut with a sound like a sigh. Over the following nights, the hum became voices, whispering his name, calling him softly. He resisted at first, but the voices grew more insistent, promising relief from loneliness, answers to forgotten questions. One night, driven by desperation, Ethan found a small iron key taped to the back of a loose wall panel in the basement. It was old and cold, inscribed with a symbol he didn't recognize, and I half closed. He returned to the door and inserted the key into a hidden lock that clicked open with surprising ease. The door swung inward to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. He hesitated, heart pounding. The air that rose from below smelled faintly of earth and forgotten things. The hum was louder now, a low chant of longing and sorrow. Ethan took a lantern and stepped down. The stairs wound deeper than the house's foundation should allow. The walls were bare stone, cold and slick with moisture. As he descended, the chanting grew clearer, forming words he almost understood. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a small chamber, windowless, circular, with a single chair in its center. On the chair sat a figure, draped in tattered cloth, face obscured. Ethan's breath caught as the figure raised its head. It was a mirror, not a reflection of Ethan, but of someone else entirely. A man with hollow eyes and a mouth stitched shut with black thread. The figure's lips moved silently, but Ethan heard the words in his mind. "I am the silence you seek." Fear gripped him, but he could not look away. The room pulsed, the walls breathing in time with the stitched man. Behind Ethan, the stairs vanished. He was trapped. The voices closed in whispering, chanting, promising oblivion. Ethan realized the house was not empty. It was waiting for someone to join the silence. Story 10. The Last Broadcast. The small town of Ashfield had long since lost its place on any map. A forgotten dot nestled in the folds of mist-covered hills. Its only remaining connection to the outside world was a radio tower perched on the edge of the woods, where static often swallowed signals whole. Marla was the last radio operator stationed there, assigned to maintain the transmitter despite the dwindling number of listeners. The tower was a relic, built decades ago by hands now dust, its rusting frame standing like a sentinel against the grey sky. Her days were spent in solitude, monitoring frequencies and occasionally broadcasting local news and weather. The nearest town was an hour away, but Marla rarely saw anyone. Ashfield had become a ghost town, homes boarded up and streets cracked with weeds. At night, she kept the station running, the steady hum of equipment a lullaby in the silence. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, the static broke with a faint voice. "Is anyone there?" it whispered. Marla's fingers hesitated over the controls. She scanned the frequencies, but no other transmissions came through. "Who's there?" she called softly into the microphone. The voice returned, clearer this time, a child's voice, distant and trembling. "Help me, please."
Her heart quickened.
She tried to trace the signal, but it shifted unpredictably like a shadow slipping through cracks. Over the following nights, the voice returned, sometimes pleading, sometimes whispering secrets she couldn't understand. The weather worsened, storms battering the tower and shaking the fragile building.
Power flickered, and Marla found herself drawn into the broadcasts, captivated and terrified. One night, she caught a fragment of a story, a tale of a family lost to the woods, swallowed by darkness. Their voices trapped between the trees and the radio wave. She felt the cold creeping into her bones, as if the voice was not just a message, but a presence.
The radio room grew colder.
Equipment hummed with an unnatural light. Then, the broadcast changed. Now the voice spoke directly to her.
Marla,
"Stay with us. Don't leave."
she tried to turn off the transmitter, but the controls were unresponsive, locked in place. Outside, the wind howled. The tower's shadow stretched long, as if reaching for her. Marla sat frozen, the voice surrounding her, echoing through the room.
Her breath came shallow as the radio whispered promises of company, safety, and escape.
When the morning came, the townsfolk found the radio tower silent, the building dark and empty. Marla was gone. Only the radio remained, faint static filling the air. And if you listen closely, sometimes you can hear her voice, carried on the wind, calling out for help or perhaps to keep someone else from leaving.
Story 11. The Lantern Keeper.
In the northern village of Grimoire, where the sun sank early and the fog clung like a living thing, the lighthouse stood abandoned. For years, it had guided no ships, its light extinguished, its walls crumbling under the weight of salt and time. Yet, locals spoke in whispers of a figure who appeared on stormy nights, a lantern swinging in hand, moving steadily along the cliff's edge.
No one knew who he was until Thomas arrived.
Thomas had come to Grimoire to escape the city's noise, to find solace in the quiet and the crashing waves. The village was small, its people wary of strangers, eyes sharp as flint beneath knitted brows.
He rented a small cottage near the shore and soon learned of the lighthouse tales.
The villagers warned him against wandering after dusk, but Thomas's curiosity outweighed caution.
One evening, with the sky heavy and rain beginning to fall, Thomas decided to explore the lighthouse ruins. The door was ajar, creaking softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with salt and mold.
Broken glass littered the floor, and the remnants of rusted machinery whispered of a forgotten era. As he climbed the spiral staircase, a sudden chill brushed his neck, and he thought he heard footsteps behind him. At the top, the lantern room was empty dark, except for a faint glow beyond the shattered windows. Thomas stepped outside onto the narrow balcony and saw him, a man tall and thin, lantern held high, pacing the cliff's edge. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but Thomas felt the weight of 1,000 sorrows in his presence. "Who are you?" Thomas called, voice trembling.
The man stopped and turned slowly. His eyes were deep wells of loneliness, reflecting the storm-tossed sea.
"I am the keeper," he said, voice a low murmur carried by the wind. "Keeper of what?" Thomas asked. "Of light, of souls,
Of those lost to the sea and to themselves."
The man gestured to the horizon where lightning danced among dark waves.
"They come for me when the storm calls," he continued.
"And I guide them home, or to their rest." Thomas felt a strange pull, a yearning to follow the keeper into the storm. Suddenly, the lantern's light flared bright, blinding. When Thomas blinked, the keeper was gone. Only the steady crashing of waves remained.
Days later, villagers found Thomas wandering near the cliffs, eyes vacant, mumbling about voices in the wind and lanterns that never died. He never spoke of what he saw, but sometimes, in the dead of night, a faint lantern glow could be seen moving along the cliffs to now swirling slowly with the fog. Story 12. The Silent Village. When Amelia's car sputtered to a halt, miles from anywhere, she was already tired, her thoughts clouded by the endless rain and the twist of the narrow country road. She had been driving for hours, trying to escape the noise of the city and the ghosts of her recent loss. But now she was stranded, rain tapping steadily against the windshield. Through the mist, she saw a faint glow-warm light spilling from a cluster of old cottages, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods. Relief flooded her as she grabbed her umbrella and stepped out into the cold.
The village looked like something from another time.
Stone cottages with moss-covered roofs, narrow lanes paved with worn cobblestones, and flower boxes wilting under the drizzle. But there was no sign of life, no children's laughter, no dogs barking, no smoke rising from chimneys.
Amelia called out softly, but her voice was swallowed by the silence.
She approached a small tavern, its door cracked open, a faint glow inside.
The scent of stale ale and wood smoke drifted out. Inside, a handful of figures sat around tables, faces downcast, eyes dull and vacant.
They barely acknowledged her presence.
When she asked for help, the bartender, an old man with deep lines etched into his face, simply nodded, sliding a cup of warm tea across the bar.
No phone signal, he said quietly.
Storms cut the lines. Amelia settled near the hearth, watching as the patrons moved like shadows, their conversations a low murmur without words. She tried to sleep that night, but was haunted by strange dreams. Voices calling from the forest, faint cries on the wind, and a feeling of being watched. The next morning, Amelia ventured outside, hoping to find someone willing to talk.
She wandered the village streets, noticing that the same faces appeared everywhere, silent and still, their eyes following her with unblinking attention. She found the church at the center of the village, its door ajar.
Inside, the pews were empty, but the altar was covered with wilted flowers and faded photographs.
On a wooden bench, a notebook lay open, pages filled with hastily scrawled writing.
They watch from the shadows.
We speak only in silence now.
The forest takes what we say.
Amelia's heart pounded as she realized the villagers were trapped in a silence deeper than mere quiet, a silence enforced by something outside the village, something ancient and hungry. That night, she heard footsteps outside her window, slow and deliberate.
A figure stood beneath the flickering street lamp, clad in grey, face hidden in shadow. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Fear took root, spreading like cold ink. Amelia gathered what little she had and fled into the woods, the trees closing around her like walls. Behind her, the village faded into the mist, a silent prison that would hold its secrets forever.
Story 13 echoes beneath the floorboards. The old house on Willow Lane had been empty for years before Clara moved in.
It wasn't much to stories. A creaky porch, peeling wallpaper that whispered of faded elegance.
But to Clara, it was a fresh start, a place to rebuild after the turmoil of her last life.
She arrived on a damp afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The neighbors watched silently as she carried her few belongings inside.
The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, a faint metallic tang she couldn't place.
The first few nights passed in uneasy sleep, dreams of footsteps pacing the hallway when she was sure she was alone. Clara told herself it was the house settling, old pipes shifting, or just her imagination running wild. But soon, the subtle sounds began to creep into her waking hours. Soft tapping beneath the floorboards, whispered syllables that faded the moment she turned her head. The floor beneath her feet seemed to hum with a pulse not quite heartbeat, but close enough to unsettle. One evening, as the rain pattered softly against the windows, Clara sat in the living room, trying to read. The house was cloaked in shadows, the only light a flickering candle. Suddenly, the tapping grew louder, rhythmic now, like a slow knock from below. Her breath caught. "Hello," she whispered, voice trembling. No reply, just the persistent tapping.
Curiosity overcame fear, and she knelt near the wooden floor, pressing her ear against the aged planks.
The tapping morphed into faint words, as if someone was trying to speak from beneath the house. "Help me." The whisper was barely audible, fragile like a sigh lost in the wind. Clara's mind raced. The house was built in the 1800s, and the town archive spoke of a scandal, an old tale of a servant girl who vanished without a trace. Some said she was buried in the garden. Others whispered she was locked away, forgotten beneath the very floors Clara now occupied.
Determined to find answers, Clara searched the basement the next day.
The wooden beams groaned as she descended into the cold, dank space.
Her flashlight swept across cracked walls and broken crates, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then she noticed a loose floorboard near the corner, edges once smooth as if someone had shifted it recently. Heart pounding, Clara pried it open, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. Inside lay a bundle of old letters, yellowed and fragile, tied with a faded ribbon. She untied them carefully.
The letters were from the servant girl, Mary, a name from the archives addressed to a man she loved but was forbidden to see. The last letter was a desperate plea for help, mentioning a locked room beneath the house and a silence that suffocates.
That night, Clara dreamed again this time. She was no longer alone.
A shadow hovered beneath the floorboards, reaching up with translucent fingers. The air grew heavy, the walls closing in. She woke gasping, the letters clutched tightly in her hand.
Determined to uncover the truth, Clara returned to the basement and found an old trapdoor concealed beneath a rug.
The lock was rusted, but gave way with effort. Inside was a narrow staircase descending into pitch darkness.
She hesitated, then stepped down.
The air was thick and cold, smelling of earth and decay. At the bottom, she found a small chamber bare stone walls, a single wooden chair, and a faint echo of a lullaby humming through the silence. Clara felt eyes watching her.
From the shadows emerged a pale figure, a young woman in a tattered dress, eyes hollow but filled with sorrow.
"Help me," she whispered, voice like the tapping beneath the floorboards.
Clara reached out, but the figure faded like mist.
The chamber began to tremble. Panicked, Clara climbed the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind her. Back in the light, the tapping ceased, but the house had changed. Rooms felt colder, shadows deeper, and sometimes, when she was alone, Clara could still hear the faint whisper beneath the floorboards, a plea for freedom that would never come. Story 14. The Reflection in Room 7. The Thornhill Inn sat on the edge of the forest, its weathered wooden sign creaking in the wind.
Travellers passed it by, deterred by the thick fog that often settled around its peeling paint and darkened windows.
But for Eleanor, it was a refuge from a life unravelling at the seams. She arrived just before dusk. The sky bruised with purples and greys, rain beginning to fall in soft taps against the carriage windows. The innkeeper, a gaunt man with eyes like storm clouds, handed her the key to room 7 without a word. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with wallpaper yellowed and peeling, a single bed, and a cracked mirror hanging crooked on the wall opposite the bed.
That first night, Eleanor found sleep elusive.
The wind moaned through the cracks, and the rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof. In the mirror's glass, she thought she saw movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the frame. She shook her head, blaming fatigue and the stranger's unease that had crept into her heart over the past weeks. But the next morning, a faint smear of dirt appeared on the mirror's surface, like a handprint left by something unseen.
Throughout the day, Eleanor explored the village nearby, but an unsettling feeling clung to her.
The locals avoided her gaze, and whispers seemed to drift on the wind.
Returning to the inn, she noticed the mirror again.
This time, the reflection held a subtle difference. Behind her, the room seemed darker, as if a shadow lurked just out of view. Eleanor spun around nothing, yet, in the mirror, the shadow remained. Days passed. Each night, the mirror revealed more. A figure standing silently behind her, a pair of eyes glowing faintly in the dim light.
Eleanor's dreams grew vivid and strange. She wandered dark corridors, hearing whispers calling her name, their air thick with sorrow and longing.
One night, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her door, slow, deliberate. She opened its empty hallway, shrouded in fog. Returning inside, the mirror caught her eye. The figure was closer now, face half hidden in shadow, lips moving in silent speech. Terrified, Eleanor tried to cover the mirror, but the darkness seeped beneath the edges, pooling like ink on the floor. Driven by dread and desperation, she confronted the innkeeper the next day. He regarded her with a grim expression. "Room 7 has a history," he said quietly. "Long ago, a woman vanished here, trapped between reflections, unable to cross back. Some say her sorrow lingers in the glass." Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle deep in her chest.
That night, the figure reached out from the mirror, its cold fingers brushing her cheek in the reflection.
Eleanor fled the room, the inn, the village.
But no matter where she went, the mirror's gaze followed, haunting the edges of her vision, whispering promises she could never refuse. In quiet moments, she wondered if she had become the reflection trapped inside room 7, waiting for another to take her place.
And somewhere, far away, the Thornhill Inn still stood, its windows dark, its mirror waiting.
Story 15. The Fog That Never Left.
Miles outside the nearest town, past winding roads swallowed by dense woods, stood the remnants of an old asylum, long abandoned and left to crumble. For years, locals whispered about the place the patients who vanished, the doctors who were driven mad, and the fog that never seemed to lift from the ground.
Elias had always been drawn to forgotten places, the kind that held stories trapped in their silence. When he heard the asylum was slated for demolition, he decided to visit one last time, camera in hand, hoping to capture the ghosts of a past no one dared speak aloud. He arrived just as the sun was dipping behind the horizon, the sky smeared with orange and purple, casting long shadows over the rusted gates. The fog was already creeping in, thick and white, curling around dead trees and broken windows like smoke.
Pushing through the overgrown path, Elias felt the temperature drop sharply.
His breath came out in misty puffs as he approached the main building, its facade cracked and weary, windows shattered like broken eyes.
Inside, silence pressed heavy against his ears. The air was stale with dust and something else, an undercurrent of despair that clung to every corner. His flashlight beam swept across peeling paint, rusted beds, and faded graffiti left by those long gone.
As Elias ventured deeper, the fog began to seep through the cracks, filling the hallways with a chilling dampness. The further he walked, the more the world outside seemed to vanish, swallowed by the endless white. He found the records room, scattered files strewn across the floor.
One folder caught his eye marked with a patient's name, Lillian Gray. Reading the notes, Elias learned she had been committed after claiming to see things in the fog whispers. Because moving just beyond sight, she disappeared without explanation, the records abruptly ending. A sudden shuffling echoed down the corridor.
Elias spun around, heart pounding.
Nothing, just the fog swirling thickly around his feet. The walls seemed to breathe, narrowing and expanding, as if the asylum itself were alive. His flashlight flickered, and then dim again.
Elias pressed on, drawn toward a distant glow. He reached a narrow window overlooking the grounds, but outside, only the fog stretched endlessly, swallowing everything in its path.
Then a shadow moved, a figure barely visible, standing still beneath the pale moonlight.
Elias's voice caught in his throat as the figure turned slowly to face him, its eyes reflecting an impossible depth of sorrow and madness.
He stumbled backward, the fog thickening, curling up the stairs, filling the rooms with a silence that screamed. The walls closed in. Elias realized then. The fog wasn't just weather, it was a prison.
A living, breathing thing that held the lost, the forgotten, and anyone who dared to enter.
When the demolition crew arrived weeks later, the asylum was gone level to rubble and earth.
But some say, when the wind shifts just right, a thick fog rises from the hollow ground, carrying with it faint whispers, footsteps, and the mournful gaze of eyes that never left. Story 16. Whispers in the Hollow.
The hollow was a name that came with warnings. Nestled deep within an ancient forest, it was a small valley ringed by gnarled trees whose branches twisted like arthritic fingers against the sky.
No one lived there anymore, at least, not the living.
The few who dared venture near spoke of whispers that rode the wind, voices that seemed to crawl beneath your skin and seep into your mind. Nathan found himself drawn there, despite every warning he'd heard. His curiosity was a slow burn, a hunger to uncover the truth behind the rumors that had haunted his childhood, stories of a vanished village swallowed by the forest, and a darkness that lingered long after the last house had burned.
He arrived just before sunset, the sky a bruise of pink and grey.
The path into the hollow was overgrown, wildflowers bowing under the weight of recent rain, and the air was thick with moss and decay.
As he stepped into the valley, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the forest grew unnervingly silent.
Even the birds had fallen mute, Nathan's boots sank into the damp earth as he followed a faint trail leading to a cluster of crumbling stone foundations, the skeleton of the village long reclaimed by roots and weeds.
He knelt beside a moss-covered clock, half buried in dirt.
The faded letters read, "Here lies Ashborough,
Forgotten by time,
remembered by none." The wind shifted, and with it came a soft murmur, a sound like distant voices carried on a breath. Nathan strained his ears.
the whispers grew clearer, forming words not spoken aloud, but echoed in his mind.
"Come home." The hairs on his neck prickled.
He scanned the ruins, eyes darting among broken walls and shattered glass.
Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a woman, pale as moonlight, her hair tangled and wet, eyes hollow yet imploring.
Nathan! Her voice was a melody and a warning.
He took a step forward.
She vanished like mist.
Panic welled inside him.
He turned to leave, but the path had shifted, the trees closing in, branches grasping like hands.
The whispers returned, urgent now, a chorus of voices begging and pleading. Stay. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes.
Time lost meaning. Nathan found himself trapped in the hollow, caught between past and present, the boundary thinning like fragile glass. His mind frayed as the voices seeped deeper, rewriting memories, distorting reality.
When the search party came days later,
They found the forest silent, the hollow empty except for the faintest echo of laughter and the slow, persistent whisper of forgotten names.
Nathan was never seen again, but sometimes travellers claimed to hear voices carried on the wind, whispers calling their names, begging them to stay, to join the endless chorus in the hollow.
Story 17. The Lighthouse at Dusk. The sea had always called to Jonas a distant murmur beneath the roar of the waves, a voice that seemed to echo through the salt and spray.
For years, he had worked as a keeper of lighthouses, solitary sentinels guiding ships through treacherous waters.
But none haunted him as deeply as the old lighthouse at Raven's Point. It was a forgotten outpost perched on jagged cliffs, where the wind tore at the rocks and the ocean thundered relentlessly below.
The last keeper had vanished without a trace nearly a decade ago, leaving the light unlit, the building abandoned.
Yet sailors whispered of a glow on stormy nights, a flicker that pierced the fort in darkness.
Jonas accepted the job reluctantly, drawn by the mystery and the promise of isolation.
He arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges.
The air was thick with salt and the sharp tang of seaweed. The lighthouse loomed before him, towering, weather-beaten, its windows dark and empty. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Paint peeled from the walls, and the wooden floorboards creaked beneath his boots. Jonas climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, where the glass panes were cracked, and the mechanism rusted still. That night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, he heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and persistent, coming from below. Jonas descended, flashlight cutting through the shadows. The sound led him to the basement, a damp, claustrophobic space filled with broken equipment and forgotten crates. The tapping ceased. Silence swallowed the space.
But then, a whisper of voice, fragile and desperate, seemed to seep from the walls. "Help me."
Jonas's heart hammered as he scanned the darkness. No one was there. Over the following days, the strange occurrences multiplied. The lamp flickered on its own, strange footprints appeared in the dusk, and at night, the air was filled with soft, singing, haunting melodies that twisted his dreams.
He found an old journal tucked behind a loose stone in the wall, the entries dated decades prior.
The keeper wrote of a visitor, a woman who came seeking shelter during a fierce storm. She never left. Instead, she became part of the lighthouse, her prisons bleeding into its very stones. Jonas began to feel watched, a cold presence lingering just beyond sight.
His reflection in the cracked glass no longer seemed quite his own.
One stormy night, lightning illuminated the lantern room.
Through the shattered panes, he saw her, a woman in a wet dress, hair clinging to her face, eyes full of sorrow.
She reached out, whispering, "Stay with me."
Frozen, Jonas felt himself drawn to her, the boundary between past and present dissolving. When dawn broke, the lighthouse was empty.
Jonas was gone.
Locals say that on foggy nights, the light at Raven's Point still flickers, And if you listen closely, you can hear the faint singing of a lonely voice carried on the wind. Story 18. The House That Watches. On the outskirts of town, past cracked sidewalks and forgotten streets, stood a house unlike any other. It was an old Victorian with dark, peeling paint and windows shuttered against the world.
For years, it sat empty, its silence stretching like a wound beneath the sky.
People said the house watched you, that the shutters weren't just to keep out wind and rain, but to hide something inside, something that never let go. Mara wasn't one for superstition, but when she inherited the house from a distant relative she barely knew, she felt a weight settle in her chest as she approached the front gate.
The air was thick with decay, and the sky had turned a slate grey. The moment she stepped inside, a chill slithered along her spine. The house was colder than she expected. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and the air smelled faintly of rot and old paper. The walls seemed to lead inward, closing in, pressing silence down on her like a heavy blanket.
At night, the house was alive with sound.
Soft footsteps echoed through empty halls. Doors creaked open and closed without pause. And always the sensation of eyes watching from behind curtains, from cracks in the wood, from the darkness beyond the flickering candlelight.
Mara tried to convince herself it was her mind playing tricks.
But the house had its own rhythm, its own breath.
And it was patient.
One evening, as rain pounded the roof, she found a small, ornate mirror tucked away in the attic. Its glass was cloudy, but when she wiped it clean, the reflection showed more than her own face. Shadows moved just beyond the frame.
Faces, too faint to focus on, seemed to press against the glass, eyes desperate and wide. Mara tried to turn away, but the house wouldn't let her. She began hearing whispers, soft, urgent, like a conversation just beyond hearing. The voices grew louder each night, pleading, threatening, coaxing.
Sleep became a distant memory.
Her reflection in every window and mirror twisted, sometimes smiling when she wasn't. One night, she awoke to the sound of breathing, heavy and ragged, close to her ear.
She spun around nothing, but the mirror on the wall shattered, spiderweb cracks spreading like veins.
The next morning, the neighbors noticed Mara had stopped answering her phone. When they checked on her, the house was empty. No sign she'd ever lived there except the mirror shards scattered across the floor, and the faintest imprint of a hand pressed into the dusty window pane.
Some say the house claims those who enter, trapping them inside reflections and shadows, watching through the eyes of those lost within. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear the house breathe.
Story 19. The Silent Room. The town's old hospital had long since closed, its brick walls crumbling, windows shattered, and halls swallowed by shadow.
Everyone knew the stories how patients whispered of a room where no sound ever entered or escaped, a room that swallowed voices whole.
No one dared enter it.
Some said it was cursed, others that something worse waited inside.
Evelyn was a nurse once, before burnout and grief pushed her away from the life she loved.
When she heard about the abandoned hospital slated for demolition, she saw an opportunity not for adventure, but for closure.
She wanted to confront the ghost that lingered in her mind, the echoes of pain she could not forget.
She slipped through a broken side door just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fading light bleeding through shattered glass like snow poison.
The air was cold and thick with dust and decay. Evelyn's flashlight cut through the darkness as she wandered the empty corridors.
Faded signs hung crooked, and graffiti scribbled in desperate scrawls covered the walls.
She found the room easily, the door marked simply, but the silence beyond was profound, unnerving.
Inside, the air was thick but still.
Her breath didn't echo, no matter how loudly she spoke. No sound returned. It was as if the room existed outside the realm of noise. Evelyn tried tapping on the walls, but the sound never left her fingertips.
She dropped to her knees, listening for the faintest echo. Nothing. Time seemed to slow.
She felt a pressure in her chest, as if the room was compressing the air around her, squeezing out every whisper of life.
Suddenly, a faint pulse vibrated beneath the floor, a rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat.
Her pulse quickened.
The walls began to shimmer, surfaces rippling like water disturbed.
Then, out of the silence,
A soft voice, a child's whisper, broke through.
Help me.
Evelyn's skin prickled with cold dread. She called out, but no sound escaped her lips. Panic clawed at her throat. The room seemed to breathe, the air thickening with unseen weight. Images flickered behind her eyelids, faces pressed against glass, eyes wide and empty. Voices silenced forever. She staggered back, desperate to escape the room that swallowed all sound. Bursting through the door, the noise of the outside world crashed over her footsteps. Wind, distant sirens. But something had followed her. A stillness clung to her skin, a silence in her mind that no words could break. Later, when asked about the hospital, Evelyn's eyes darkened. The silent room, she whispered. It's not empty. It waits. And if you listen too long, you'll join the silence.
Story 20. The Last Light of Greywood Manor.
Greywood Manor was a place swallowed by time and shadow, nestled deep in a forgotten valley. It stood alone amid towering oaks whose twisted branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers.
No one had lived there for decades, and the locals spoke of the manor in hushed tones, an unspoken fear woven into their stories, a darkness that seeped from its walls.
Alistair arrived on a damp autumn evening, the sun low and weak behind thick clouds. He was a historian, drawn to the manor by letters and diaries long buried in archives, fragments of a family's slow descent into madness and silence.
He sought answers to questions no one else dared ask. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, and the air smelled of earth and cold stone.
Fog curled along the ground, wrapping the manor in a ghostly shroud.
Inside, the house was vast and hollow.
Floorboards whispered beneath his feet, and the air was heavy with dust and memories. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him, watching, waiting.
As night fell, the house grew colder, the shadows thickening like ink pouring beneath the fading light.
Alistair lit a candle, its flickering flame barely pushing back the darkness that pressed from every corner.
He found the study, walls lined with books and papers, journals filled with trembling handwriting.
The family story unfolded, a tale of isolation, despair, and a presence that had come to claim them one by one.
The last entry spoke of a light, the last light of the manor, a candle lit each night to keep the darkness at bay.
But one night, the candle had gone out.
Alistair felt a sudden chill as the candle flickered and died in his hand.
Darkness consumed the room. From the blackness came a whisper, a slow, steady voice that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. Light, light. Keep the light.
Hands brushed against his arm, cold and desperate.
He fumbled for matches, striking one with shaking fingers.
The flame revealed the room empty, yet alive with unseen presence.
He lit a candle and placed it on the desk. The flame steadied, but the shadows did not recede. The manor seemed to breathe, its walls contracting and expanding like a living thing.
Whispers rose to a crescendo, voices pleading, crying out in anguish.
Alistair realized then, the darkness was hunger itself, fed by fear and silence.
As the candle burned low, he understood the terrible truth. The light was a fragile barrier, and once it died, the manor would claim him, like the others. His breath caught in his throat as the shadows reached out, tendrils of blackness curling like smoke.
Desperately, he lit another candle, and then another, a small constellation of fragile lights flickering against the encroaching dark. But outside the windows, the night pressed on, endless and merciless.
When dawn finally broke, the manor stood silent once more.
Alistair was gone. Only the candles remained still burning, faint beacons in the eternal gloom. And somewhere beyond the trees, the wind whispered through the branches, carrying the faintest echo of a warning. Keep the light, or be consumed.